Tonight on the program, we explore the duties of volunteers coming out to help those in need during the COVID-19 pandemic, how the popular beach of Pattaya prepares for its reopening, an exclusive interview with the German ambassador to Thailand, and another exclusive talk with Thanphuying Sirikitiya Jensen on her life as a curator. Sawadika, I'm Nab Bunaga. Welcome to This Week with Thai PBS World. Based on what you've seen, the highlights, you can expect that we're going to talk about the volunteers that came out to help those in need during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll begin tonight with a special report exploring the lives of those volunteers, as well as finding out why they decided to come out and help others.
พี่ทำมาเยอะไอ้ตรงนี้ถือว่าธรรมดาก็ไม่ได้รวยนะแต่ว่าอาศัยว่าเรามีนะเราก็ต้องให้ถูกป่ะ
I think what we're trying to do is do the best we can to minimize or at least to shorten this crisis.
เส้นได้ก็จะมีข้อมูลตรงนี้ว่าชุมชนนี้มียอดผู้ป่วยเท่าไหร่ยอดผู้กักตัวเท่าไหร่ครับทางเส้นได้ก็เลยจัดหาพวกข้าวสารอาหารแห้งหรือข้าวสดมาช่วยในเรื่องตรงนี้ด้วยครับ
ภูมิใจมากเพราะว่าบางคนแบบลูกค้าแบบคนชราอย่างเงี้ยออกไปข้างนอกไม่ได้แต่ว่ามีเรามาช่วยซื้อของให้เขาอะไรอย่างเงี้ยคือทำให้เขาแบบอยู่ที่บ้านไม่ต้องออกไปเองนี้ให้เขาได้มีของเงี้ยก็คือยังภูมิใจเหมือนกันค่ะ
These are just some of the thousands of volunteers across Thailand who have been donating their time and energy to help those in need. The latest wave of COVID-19 infections, which began in April this year and is ongoing, means many of these volunteers have not had a day off for over 4 months. They have one goal: to help the country survive, and some of these volunteer groups even use the word survive to brand their efforts. From daily hot meals to oxygen tanks and setting up isolation centers, the demand and the kind of help is getting more and more complicated. When asked if they are scared about getting infected themselves, they say of course they do. But they feel that all these gaps in the Thai system need to be filled somehow.
หมอพยาบาลเจ้าหน้าที่บุคลากรทางการแพทย์ต่างเหนื่อยล้ามาเต็มทีนะครับผมก็เลยคิดว่าถ้าเกิดเรายังคงมอบภาระหน้าที่ตรงนี้ให้กับทางหมอหรือพยาบาลหรือเจ้าหน้าที่ภาคส่วนเฉพาะในส่วนของสาธารณสุขเนี่ยมันจะไม่ไหวนะครับผมคิดว่าทุกคนจะหล่นเราในฐานะพี่น้องประชาชนเราควรจะช่วยกันทำตรงไหนได้เราต้องร่วมกันทำนะครับ
Well, we will go on until the end. We're devoted to do that, and
we have a lot of work to do. Just hopefully one day this will be a different story. You know.
Helping the country to survive is actually the ultimate goal for all the volunteers that came out to help others in need during the COVID-19 pandemic. And apart from the volunteers that we've just seen, there's another volunteer that played a huge role. That is Forrest Lee, who's an expat in Thailand as well as a YouTuber. So he will be reflecting the problems behind the pandemic compared to other countries.
Many businesses have had to close during the COVID-19 lockdown. For many, no work means no income and no food. Although the government has been attempting to help them out through various financial aid measures and stimulus schemes, it's not quite enough for the needy, especially the immigrant workers. This has spurred various groups of volunteers into action. They have been helping as much as they can, and all of them share a common goal, which is to help people get through this crisis. This Thai style of social support offered by volunteers includes that provided by many expats as well, including Forrest Lee.
And as an expat living here and has been coming to this country since 2017, you know, I'm in a privileged position where I feel like it's part of my social responsibility to help out as much as I can. So I decided to do, you know, just seeing everything that's going on here in Thailand. Like a lot of the people were, you know, with the lockdown, a lot of people were out of work. You know, they needed food. There's no Thailand doesn't have like a social security service system like, let's say, in like Western countries like in the United States, Australia, Canada. They're not afforded government assistance. At the time I was over in Pattaya, and seeing everything that was going on, like with the lockdowns, a lot of people can't find food, a lot of people can't eat. I'm thinking and it just doesn't make sense for me to just to travel around and just create content. I'm like, this is my favorite country in the world. Like I want to at least like do my part in helping the Thai people, And I always raised by my parents to say, like, if you see somebody that needs help, like help them out. Do something about it. Be selfless and help them out.
As we began giving away boxes of food and water, there was an unsung hero, a volunteer in a blue jacket, who helped organize the lines and distribute food. What surprised me the most was that everyone in line made sure that everyone had food to eat. I was taken aback. Even at their most vulnerable, the Thais are naturally caring and communal group of wonderful people.
Really appreciate this man helping out. It means so much.
During the peak period, the number of new COVID-19 infected cases reached new highs almost every day. Thousands of COVID patients were desperate to get a bed, while the hospitals turned down the new cases because they were full. To prevent the breakdown of the healthcare system, home isolation and community-field hospitals were introduced and quickly began to function. Forrest raised funds through his follower community on his YouTube channel, and he donated the money to a third-party organization. His financial support covered the cost of renovation at the school in Ekamai, which turned into an isolation center and field hospital.
So through subscriber donation and through just linking up with Bangkok Community Help, we were able to donate or actually replace air conditionings. So there's a school near Ekamai that's repurposed into a field hospital, and one of the buildings is where the nurses sleep at, so they can sleep there in between their shifts helping COVID patients. But that particular nurses' quarters it looked terrible. It wasn't renovated for a long time. The aircon wasn't fixed. The last aircon maintenance was in 1995. And when I heard about that, I was like, that's outrageous. Like, they didn't have the budget or the funds to service that aircon.
Working alongside expat volunteers from the Bangkok Community Health Foundation in his donation project at the isolation center, Forrest was inspired by the dedication of those foreign volunteers. For him, the volunteer work produces beautiful moments amid the bleak situation.
Just seeing how caring and nurturing Thai people really are. Like walking down the street, I would see cars and cars of people, in their sedans and their SUVs, dropping off cases of food and water to the homeless and to the needy and less fortunate. And even some of the homeless people were out facilitating, just telling people to line up, how many boxes of food you need, how much water you need. Everybody was taking care of each other. It was emotional. I was taken aback by it. It was a beautiful thing to see. It just gave me a whole mix of emotions.
And with all the volunteers that are coming out to help these communities, it also indicates whether the health system is about to collapse. And Kun Tilip Naksumpoplau had a chance to interview the National Health Security Office on this issue.
Yes, Nat, Dr. Yupadi Sirisinsuk admitted that when the outbreak was at its peak in July, the health service system in Thailand was very close to collapse. And that was when the authority decided to introduce a new model of care, home isolation, community isolation, or they call it HICI. And she said that volunteers has been taking care of vulnerable groups long before that because this group could not access the system. So when HICI began, volunteers play a very important role in the part that to make this possible and help save life.
เรามีข้อมูลสถิติคนไข้รออยู่ถึงหลายวันนะคะบางคนที่จะได้เห็นภาพก็คือว่าคนไข้นอนเสียชีวิตที่บ้านเพราะไม่มีใครติดตามดูอาการนะคะกลุ่มวอลันเทียร์เนี่ยก็จะเข้าไปเติมเต็มตรงนี้ค่ะ นะคะที่ช่วยแม้กระทั่งดูอาการซัพพอร์ตจิตใจนะคะแล้วก็ดูในเรื่องของออกซิเจนแม้กระทั่งถังออกซิเจนถ้ามีอาการรุนแรง
Dr. Yupadi also recognized that there might be some negative feelings toward the system when not everybody could be admitted to the medical facilities. But she believes that the situation got better after the general public began to understand that it is not that the system discriminating anyone, but because the system was working at its full capacity, it simply cannot take any more patients. And now talking about volunteers, besides helping with treatment, equipment, and food, she said that the health volunteers also help people in distress because they have to be home instead of the hospital.
ในท่ามกลางความทุกข์นะของคนไข้ที่ติดโควิดเนี่ยอยู่ที่บ้านเนี่ยความกังวลว่าไม่ได้เข้าโรงพยาบาลเนี่ยก็เครียดนะคะเครียดมากนะคะถ้ามีคุณหมอโทรศัพท์ไปเนี่ยนะคะเขาก็รู้สึกดีขึ้น
She believes that although this is a very difficult time for everyone, but the cooperation between the volunteers and government units is in best interest for everybody. And there is also another group of people that she thinks should be recognized. They are the heads of communities. Many of them have turned their own homes to be isolation facilities.
อีกส่วนหนึ่งที่น่าสนใจก็คือว่าที่เล่าไปนะคะว่ากรณีคนไข้ที่อยู่ในชุมชนแล้วเขาไม่มีที่ไปเนี่ยแล้วกลุ่มประธานชุมชนเองนะคะแกนนำเนี่ยเขาก็พยายามสร้างศูนย์พักคอยนะคะหรือ community isolation ในชุมชนในช่วงนั้นเนี่ยเครือข่ายอาสาสมัครอาจจะเป็นอาสาสมัครสาธารณสุขนะคะอสม.หรืออสส.ในกรุงเทพเนี่ยนะคะก็ได้เข้าไปมีบทบาทนะคะในการดูแลคนเหล่านี้
So as Dr. Yupadi said that the cooperation among all different groups in the society is the main driving force, making sure Thailand survived this pandemic. Back to you, Nat.
All right, thank you. And that's Kun Tulip Naksumpoplav's interview with the NHSO. And with the volunteers coming out to help those in need during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people think that it reflects the culture of sharing and kindness, which has been part of Thai society for so many years. But at the same time, some people do think that with the volunteers coming out also reflects the failure on the government's handling of the pandemic. So let's find out more what people think about this issue.
ก็ดีนะครับช่วงวิกฤตอย่างนี้พวกเราคนไทยด้วยกันไม่ทิ้งกันก็ถือว่าโอเคครับยินดี
เขาก็น่ารักดีอะเขาดูแลดีอะค่ะแม้แต่ป่วยก็หาเตียงหาอะไรให้ดูแลถ้าใครกักตัวก็มียาแล้วก็มีอาหารมาส่งถึงบ้านเลยอะค่ะ
มีครับก็มาช่วยชุมชนครับผมก็ดีครับแบบช่วยเหลือคนแบบคนที่ตกงานด้วยก็ทุกคนก็แบบมีกำลังใจครับผม
บางคนก็อาจจะมองว่าทำไมแบบรัฐบาลถึงมันน่าจะเป็นงานของรัฐบาลหรือเปล่าแต่ว่ามันกลายเป็นแบบว่าประชาชนก็ช่วยกันเองอย่างเงี้ยอันนี้ตัวเองมองไงกันบ้างครับ
มีส่วน
ครับเราก็รัฐบาลช่วยเหลือไม่ทั่วถึงครับ
รัฐบาลไม่ทำเราต้องทำคนเองครับผมก็ต้องอย่างนั้นนะฮะ
รัฐบาลก็เขาเยอะอยู่แล้วอ่ะเป็นนะเขารับผิดชอบเยอะนี่นะแล้วลงมาก็จะต้องเป็นหน้าที่ของผู้นำชุมชนนะคะ
มันก็มองได้สองแง่สองมุมนะครับรัฐบาลเขาก็ทำงานของเขาก็หนักช่วงหนึ่งส่วนกลุ่มที่เขามีอาสาอะไรมาช่วยก็อีกด้านหนึ่งก็ดูภาพรวมๆก็ถือว่าโอเคนะครับเราต้องช่วยกันนะครับอย่าเพิ่งไปคิดต่างตอนนี้นะครับ
And now let's move on to the issue of reopening Thailand. Last week, we explored the street food culture in Chiang Mai province. Now our team has traveled to Pattaya, where they talked to the locals whether they agree with the delayed reopening to November 1st. Let's find out more in this report by Kun Hatthai Sirikitiya.
We are right here at Bali High Bay in Pattaya, and in this so-called sin city is not so sinful anymore because its famous nightlife and all the entertainment that the city is famous for, it is quite an abandoned ghost town. Actually, right now it's supposed to be the reopening city, but because of the delayed opening to November 1st, things are still quiet. Not as many people are coming, especially for the lack of foreign tourists. Street vendors that we have talked to are so desperate to get the city being revived and reopened, and so that everything would get back to normal. So let's see what they have to say.
แย่มากของมากๆอ่ะ ติดช่วงเคอร์ฟิวอ่ะแต่ว่าเวลามันน้อยจัดตอนเย็นน่ะพอเขา3 ทุ่มอย่างเงี้ย2 ทุ่มป้าก็ต้องรีบกลับแล้วยังกำลังจะลงมากินก็ไปหมดแล้วถ้าเขาเปิดเมืองก็อาจจะดีขึ้นมานิดนึงเปิดเมืองก็อาจจะแบบประเภทว่าค่า 60% น่ะแต่จะให้เต็ม100คงเป็นไปไม่ได้หรอก
ไม่พอหรอกอดดักยากันไปก็ขายไม่ได้เลยอ่ะมันไม่มีคนอ่ะคิดว่าดีก็มันจะได้หากินง่ายหน่อยแต่ไม่รู้จะมีคนมาเที่ยวไหมมีคนนิดหน่อยเองช่วงนี้ก็รอเปิดประเทศเพราะไม่มีแขกต่างชาตินะอยู่บ้านเฉยๆไม่ได้ค้าขายอะไรหรอกใช้เงินเก่าหมดที่สะสมไว้อะตอนนี้ก็หมดแล้วด้วย ไม่มีแล้วเลยก็ต้องออกมาทำมันถึงจะไม่มีแขกก็ต้องคนทำไปเลยดีกว่าอยู่เปล่าๆผมก็ไม่รู้จะไปค้าขายอะไรอ่ะก็ดูการค้าขายในตลาดอะไรมันก็ซบเซาไปหมด
And we have to admit that Pattaya is like a ghost town, and many of the businesses have been deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And now let's look at the other top stories in the weekly roundup.
The CCSA has extended the nationwide state of emergency to the end of November. However, it also decided to shorten the nighttime curfew in the dark red provinces to 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. instead of 9 p.m. for at least 15 days, and also easing some of the partial lockdown measures effective from today, October 1st. Flood warnings have been issued in Bangkok and 8 other provinces. People living along riverbanks and in low-lying areas in such provinces are advised to brace for possible flooding from overflowing Chao Phraya and Basak rivers from today until October 5th. At the same time, the City Hall advised those living along the riverside in 7 districts of Bangkok to move their valuables to higher ground in anticipation of water level rise in the Chao Phraya River between now and next Tuesday. The Constitutional Court has postponed its ruling on same-sex marriage to December 14. A representative for the Foundation for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Rights and Justice said it was the 3rd time the ruling was postponed.
And now it's time for our weekly columns where we explore inside stories as well as exclusive interviews. So we'll start with the ambassador, where Kun Hatthai Sirikitiya interviewed the German embassy to Thailand, where they talked about climate change, human rights, as well as the handling of Thailand protests.
Having been in Thailand since 2018, Ambassador Georg Schmidt and his wife have been enjoying life until COVID-19 disrupted some aspects of his work and personal life.
What I really enjoy in Bangkok is just walking around a lot. Sometimes I take my scooter. All these activities were scaled back because there was a recommendation to stay at home and avoid outside contact. But when that's possible again, and when it was possible, I really enjoy walking the streets of Bangkok because there's so much you can see. Around every little corner there's a little surprise hidden. There's a good reason why so many people like coming here, because it's like many countries and cultures packed into one. You have the seaside, you have the mountains, you can have endless kind of activities. What I find very impressive in Thailand is how Thailand has managed to put this together and accommodate it and sort of diverge it into something which is then unique again.
As for bilateral relations, Germany is focusing its cooperation with Thailand on climate change, among other things.
We're Thailand's largest partner in climate change cooperation. And Thailand is very vulnerable if you actually see climate change happening. I mean, I once saw a map that said if flooding occurs, rising of sea levels occurs in the way that's predicted, then part of this garden would be underwater now. We're offering the German experience. And I think Germany and Thailand share a lot. We're both highly industrialized countries. And if we can manage to show that you can be an industrialized country, successful, and at the same time resource efficient and sustainable, I think that sets a strong example in our regions and worldwide.
Germany, like some other like-minded European countries with embassies in Bangkok, has been quite active in its advocacy for human rights and has found itself, at times, drawn into Thai politics, with different groups of protesters appealing their cases to the country.
If you look at the history of the United Nations and how the UN Declaration on Human Rights came into being, it's so much linked to what happened in the Second World War. So one thing is a German particular sensitivity. We think that the human rights and human rights cover a whole broad range of things, are so important to citizens in our countries. People should have the security that their freedoms and their individual rights, balanced against the individual rights of others, are protected by the state. Thailand, like Germany, has international commitments. We said clearly that the embassy we recognize the right for peaceful demonstration, and the stress is here on peaceful. And we gave clear signals last year in October that we are ready to receive whatever petition is handed to us. We did not make any comments on it because that's a Thai domestic issue, but we receive opinions and we pass them on to Berlin, definitely.
With Germany's Unity Day coming up on October 3rd, just like other embassies, big gatherings cannot be held this year.
In the National Day, I think it's a good way to reflect for us, like, where do we stand in our relationship and where do we go forward?
Apart from German icons like beer, cars, schnitzels, castles and football, the ambassador also highlighted the not-so-famous with diverse backgrounds and different ways of doing things that made those successes possible.
In the economic sense, we have a lot of what we call hidden champions, is the companies that are behind the BMW, that are behind the Mercedes. There are countless small companies. Behind it, there are smaller family structures. To me, that is one of the strong points of Germany. It's normal to disagree, but we have to agree how to disagree.
Sirikitiya reporting for Thai PBS World.
And now it's time for Empowering Thai Women, where we connect you to amazing women who are successful and influential in their own ways. And it is our honor to interview Thanphuying Sirikitiya Jensen on her life as a curator, as well as the challenges connecting people to Thai history.
I worked in fashion, and I know I wanted to work in culture. I had an academic background in history and culture, but in the United States, it's a job that's quite difficult to get into. And so coming back to Thailand was almost a way of getting to know myself. Thai history goes back 1,000 years or more. And so how do you go through all this information that you can't read because I couldn't read Thai? And so a lot of times I got my information from conversation and storytelling.
Thanphuying Sirikitiya Jensen describes herself as curatorial by nature, where she focuses on the interpretation of historical spaces and topics, creating interactive exhibitions to help people connect with the traces of history and culture. Two of her most successful exhibitions were Wang Na Naramit and 100 Years Between. The starting point of her journey was when her team at the Fine Arts Department took her to the National Museum. When she asked for details, however, no one could explain the story behind it, nor its significance to Thai history.
And when I asked people what it was, they said it was a museum. Most people had no idea that it was a big palace. In fact, one of the biggest things that got me into it was there's so little information on the palace itself. This is something that I thought about carefully, like, how can people not know the importance of this space or feel connected to it? So this was something that I began to see that was the biggest gap. Not necessarily even the information, but it was the fact that people didn't really feel connected to the site.
Apart from the lack of emotional connection to history among many Thais, the biggest challenge to her mission is the people's mindset. As she explains, most people believe that history and the contemporary world are separate rather than being socially integrated.
The difficulty is helping people understand that this is something that they can get involved with. And this is why I think it's really important when you work in culture that you need to create these platforms or rethink how we curate exhibitions or how we distribute information so that it's something that's not just information, but people can feel that they're part of it, which involves they need to create.
Growing up and living in the United States for 30 years, Thanphuying Sirikitiya not only wanted to pursue a career in arts and culture, but she felt that something was missing from her life. She then returned to Thailand to follow her desire to reconnect with her roots. But the biggest difficulty for her at the time was the Thai language, as she hadn't spoken Thai for many years. Therefore, she spent most of her time listening to stories for a year until she felt she understood enough.
And when you feel like there's something that you don't understand or something that's stifled or something that's erased, you feel like something's missing. I think the difficulty in the beginning was that I felt sad. Like I felt sad that how can I feel disconnected from something that was half me?
As the youngest daughter of Her Royal Highness Princess Ubonratachakanya, she admits that she wasn't used to people knowing everything she did, as she describes herself as a very sensitive and private person. Thanphuying Sirikitiya also revealed that people felt the pressure to not approach her at the beginning because of her partially royal status. Because of this, however, many of the senior officials were willing to listen to her ideas.
Maybe at my age in Thai government or in Thailand in general, it's quite difficult to push boundaries or to go beyond a certain point and get your voice out there because of age and how old you are. But I think that I used the opportunity that I saw a lot of people all the time, and that puyai and adults listen to me sometimes just by virtue, by my, luxury of who just by my privilege, I have to say. I used it as an opportunity to try to push a bit of boundaries and try to say like, hey, like, can we try this? The best advice is don't be afraid, don't apologize, think heavily. You're the only one that knows what's right for you, and as a woman, especially if you're in a public position, there are going to be people who don't like what you do, and you have to be strong with it. And also, the last thing, which is something that took me years to learn, because I am unapologetic, and this is something that's so important in Thailand, which is kindness and empathy. It's one of those things that I learned that I started to be much more successful once I was patient and once I met people where they were.
And reconnecting people to Thai history is definitely a very big challenge because people think it's not really relevant to them to begin with. And that wraps up tonight's edition of This Week with Thai PBS World. Don't forget to join us every Fridays at 11 p.m. only on Thai PBS. And also don't forget to follow us on social media as well as our website thaipbsworld.com for all the latest updates and analyses. And we'll be leaving you tonight with images of the traditional traditional Hainan puppetry by the Mangor Tong group, which is the only group that performs this sort of traditional arts in Thailand. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you next Friday. สวัสดีค่ะ